Jessica Dishon disappeared in broad daylight without a single witness. What happened next didn't feel real. It read like a crime thriller, full of botched investigations, missed warnings, and years of silence. It took 15 agonizing years to uncover the truth. And when it surfaced, the nation was stunned by what had been ignored in plain sight. Welcome back to Dark Case Files, your source for deep dives into the most disturbing criminal cases around the globe. In this episode, we break down the tragic and long-overlooked murder of Jessica Dishon, a case that exposes critical failures in law enforcement, false leads, and the horrifying truth hiding in plain sight. Before we dive into today's case, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Dark Case Files. It costs you nothing, but it keeps us inspired to keep uncovering and sharing more stories like this. Now, let's get into it. Jessica Dishon was born on May 2nd, 1982, in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, a small rural town where most people worked in farming and knew their neighbors by name. As the oldest of 3 children, Jessica took on responsibility early. While her parents worked, she cared for her younger brothers, helped clean the house, and made dinner. She was dependable, mature beyond her years, and her family trusted her completely. At age 15, Jessica began working part-time at a local restaurant. Her goal was clear: save enough money to buy a red Pontiac, and she did. That car symbolized her drive. She was ambitious, goal-oriented, and determined. Even while working, Jessica maintained excellent grades. She was preparing for college with plans to study accounting and build a future beyond her small-town roots. By fall 1999, 17-year-old Jessica was in her senior year. She had just started dating someone new and was excited about her future. But on Friday, September 10th, everything changed. That morning, Jessica's parents left early for work while she was still sleeping. Her younger brothers caught the school bus. Jessica, who was scheduled to drive herself to school shortly after, never made it. Around noon, her mother returned home and immediately sensed something was wrong. Jessica's red Pontiac was still in the driveway, even though school had started hours earlier. Inside the house, Jessica was nowhere to be found. Her room looked untouched. Thinking maybe Jessica had caught a ride to school, her mother called her father, but he said he had left alone that morning. Maybe the car wouldn't start, she thought. Grabbing the spare key, she approached the Pontiac and found something chilling. The driver's door was slightly open. On the front seat lay Jessica's cell phone, its screen still showing the numbers 9 and 1, as if she had started to call for help, but was cut off. One of her shoes and her car keys were under the driver's seat. In the back seat sat her backpack, school books, work uniform, and purse. Nothing taken with her, everything left behind. Jessica's mother immediately called the school and learned that Jessica never showed up. Even worse, the school had failed to notify the family. Later that afternoon, a call from Jessica's best friend added to the fear. Jessica hadn't arrived for her shift at the restaurant either. Terrified, the Dishons called the sheriff's office, but instead of urgency, they were met with indifference. The sheriff dismissed Jessica's disappearance, suggesting she had probably run away and would come back on her own. He didn't ask about the open car door. He didn't question the abandoned cell phone. He ignored the unfinished 911 call. Jessica's parents begged for help, but the sheriff refused to file a report or start an investigation. So, the Dishons took matters into their own hands. They called friends, neighbors, and relatives. They drove every road in town, scanning fields, parking lots, and roadside ditches. But there was no sign of Jessica. The next morning, still without answers, they returned to the sheriff's office and insisted something was seriously wrong. Finally, 2 deputies were sent to check Jessica's car. But instead of handling the scene with care, they compromised it completely, touching everything inside without gloves, ignoring potential evidence, and failing to document anything properly. They didn't even search Jessica's bedroom, despite it being standard procedure. Once again, the family was left to fend for themselves. Feeling abandoned by the system, they reached out to local newspapers and news stations. They printed hundreds of missing person flyers and plastered them around town, on telephone poles, in store windows, and across car windshields. With the help of volunteers, they organized search parties, combing through fields and wooded areas. Still, Jessica was gone. No leads, no trace, and no justice. The search began with Jessica's father and Uncle Stanley. Both men knew the back roads of Shepherdsville better than anyone. Driven by fear, they started searching near the Salt River. a place known for its dense woods and criminal activity. It was a grim landscape, overgrown trails, broken glass, rusted debris. For hours they searched every path, but there was no sign of Jessica. Then something chilling happened. Early the next morning, Jessica's younger brother ran inside the house, pale and breathless. He swore he had just heard her screaming for help from outside. Their father grabbed his shotgun and sprinted out the door. His brother pulled up moments later, and they spread out across the yard, desperate to pinpoint the sound. What they saw next made their blood run cold. Gray smoke rising from the nearby property of their 40-year-old neighbor, David Brooks. As they approached, they saw him standing over a fire pit, burning what looked like clothing. Jessica's father asked Brooks if he could search the area. Brooks refused and asked them to leave. Up until Jessica vanished, the Dishons had a normal relationship with Brooks. But something changed after she went missing. Brooks began driving slowly past their home, glaring at the family with a smirk that seemed deliberately menacing. They also started receiving silent phone calls. No words, just slow, heavy breathing. The family believed Brooks was behind them, but had no proof. After the disturbing fire pit incident, the Dishons reported everything to the police. For the first time, officers agreed to bring cadaver dogs to Brooks's property. Using Jessica's clothing as scent articles, the dogs zeroed in on the fire pit. Nothing conclusive turned up, but they did alert again, this time on a pair of black gloves hidden in a shed. The gloves smelled strongly of decomposition. Despite all this, police once again walked away without making an arrest. Frustrated, Jessica's father contacted the FBI. The Bureau rarely intervenes in missing persons cases at the family's request, but this case was different. The mounting evidence was too alarming to ignore. Once briefed, the FBI launched a full-scale investigation. Unlike the local sheriff's department, they treated the case with urgency and professionalism. Agents collected fingerprints from Jessica's room and vehicle. They secured evidence and sent everything to forensic labs. Helicopters were dispatched. Volunteers combed fields and ponds near the Dishon home. Investigators scoured Brooks's property from top to bottom. In one of his sheds, they made a shocking find, a printed photograph of Jessica. That discovery changed everything. The FBI now suspected Brooks, and possibly his brother, 35-year-old Joseph, who had behaved strangely during their first visit. Yet, despite the photo and the dog's alerts, they still lacked solid, admissible evidence to press charges. So, the search continued. On September 27th, 17 days after Jessica vanished, a woman driving along a rural stretch near the river spotted something strange beneath a tree. She pulled over, got out, and walked toward it. What she saw was horrific. A body, partially hidden in brush, missing fingers and several limbs. A rope was tied around the legs, streaked with red and silver paint. Clothing was torn and partially missing. FBI agents rushed to the scene. Because of the body's advanced decomposition, they couldn't immediately confirm it was Jessica. They asked her parents to come and help identify the remains. Her father couldn't bear to look, but her mother, determined to find closure, stepped forward. At first, she wasn't sure, until she saw the small butterfly tattoo on the ankle. It was Jessica. The autopsy confirmed their worst fears. Jessica had been strangled. Her body was covered in bruises. Experts determined her fingers and limbs had been removed after death. But the most crushing revelation was this. Jessica had been alive for approximately 72 hours after she disappeared. The window to save her had been open. No one acted. After the body was found, the FBI interrogated Brooks again. His story changed. In the first interview, he claimed he'd seen Jessica on the morning she went missing. Now, he insisted he hadn't seen her at all, and said he'd been home in bed with his wife. But when agents questioned her, she contradicted his story. Investigators pressed harder. They asked Brooks what he would do if his fingerprints were found on Jessica's body. There were no such prints, but his response was bizarre and incriminating. He said, "Then I'd have to confess to everything." He also failed a polygraph test. Although they still lacked direct forensic evidence, the FBI arrested David Brooks. The trial was set for January 2003. Prosecutors faced enormous challenges. The rope found in Brooks's car resembled the one used on Jessica, but it had no DNA. A photo of Jessica was found in his shed. The gloves smelled of decomposition, but none of it was enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. During the trial, a devastating error came to light. When Jessica's remains were recovered, her missing limbs were placed in special containers labeled refrigerate, but the local police left them at room temperature, allowing advanced decomposition. Any possible DNA was lost forever. In the courtroom, Brooks's defense attorney emphasized the lack of physical evidence. He claimed the prosecution's case was based purely on suspicion. The jury couldn't agree. Without a unanimous decision, the case ended in a mistrial. Brooks walked free. By law, he couldn't be retried unless new, compelling evidence emerged. For Jessica's parents, the collapse of the case against David Brooks was a devastating blow. They had been almost certain he was responsible for their daughter's death. Worse still, they believed that if police had taken her disappearance seriously from the beginning, she might have been rescued alive. The heartbreak was indescribable. Over time, hope for justice faded, and the investigation into Jessica Dishon's murder was all but abandoned. Then, in 2012, everything changed. A new detective named Lynn Hunt joined the Bullitt County Sheriff's Office. One of her duties was reviewing cold cases, and Jessica's file landed on her desk. As soon as she began reviewing the documents, Hunt was appalled. The original investigators had left behind a trail of negligence, misfiled reports, missing interviews, and improperly documented evidence. Some key materials were so poorly recorded that Hunt was forced to rebuild the entire investigation from scratch, 13 years after the crime. Her first move was to reconnect with Jessica's family. One of Jessica's brothers, now grown and living away from home, handed over a box of his sister's belongings that had once been in her car. He'd kept it since the police returned the items years earlier. Hunt examined the contents and was stunned at how sloppily they'd been handled. None of it had been preserved according to proper evidence protocol. After all this time, the items were unlikely to be useful, but Hunt pressed on, determined not to let the same mistakes repeat themselves. While combing through Jessica's case file, Hunt found something that raised serious concerns: a copy of David Brooks's medical evaluation. It stated his IQ was just 61, borderline intellectual disability. That revelation cast his entire police interaction in a new light. If Brooks couldn't comprehend what was being asked of him, how could any of his answers be trusted? The strange behavior that once seemed suspicious might have simply been a symptom of cognitive impairment. Hunt started to believe Brooks may have been completely uninvolved, so she turned her attention elsewhere. If not Brooks, then who? She revisited every name in the file, every neighbor, every possible connection. And then, in September 2014, nearly 15 years after Jessica's murder, an unexpected call came in from a detective in another jurisdiction. An inmate at a Kentucky state prison had reached out, claiming he knew who killed Jessica Dishon. Detective Hunt approached the tip cautiously. Jailhouse confessions were notoriously unreliable. Often, inmates fabricated stories, hoping to cut a deal or improve their conditions. Still, she couldn't ignore it. She visited the prison and met with the man, who told her that he once shared a cell with someone convicted of child abuse, just like himself. They bonded over their crimes, and one day, the other inmate revealed a dark secret. He had killed Jessica Dishon. And then, the bombshell. He named the killer. It was Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle, her father's brother. According to the inmate, Stanley confessed that he had been molesting Jessica for years while living in the Dishon home. He told her that if she ever spoke about the abuse, he'd kill her, or someone she loved. In the spring of 1999, Jessica began dating a boy, and Stanley grew paranoid that she might tell him the truth. On the morning of September 10th, he confronted her while she was loading her car. Jessica threatened to go to the police. Stanley became enraged. As she attempted to call 911, he lunged at her. She broke free and ran inside the house, but he followed, assaulted her, wrapped her in bed sheets, and abducted her. He took her to an abandoned shed just miles away and kept her alive for several days, subjecting her to horrific abuse. When he finally killed her, he moved her body closer to the roadside, perhaps to ensure it would be found. He buried the bed sheets beneath the shed and, in a disturbing attempt to mislead investigators, mutilated her body in ways meant to resemble a drug cartel hit. Then came the detail that stopped Hunt cold. The inmate said Stanley had buried Jessica's missing shoe beneath a broken tree not far from the shed. This was information no one outside the family or law enforcement could have known. That shoe, and the fact that her limbs had been removed had never been disclosed publicly. Hunt knew this was more than a random jailhouse tale. It was time to find out if the claims were true. With limited manpower at the local department, Hunt enlisted the help of Jessica's brother and other relatives for a search. She didn't tell them who the suspect was, only that she was following a new lead. On the first day, they dug in the pouring rain at the described location, but found nothing. They returned the next morning. That's when Jessica's brother pointed out an abandoned barn by the roadside. They decided to check inside. Within minutes of digging into the dirt floor, they unearthed a buried bedsheet. Hunt took it back to Jessica's bedroom, which her parents had kept untouched for over a decade. The pattern was a perfect match. It was one of Jessica's missing sheets. It was the first physical evidence tying someone to her abduction. Stanley Dishon was arrested shortly afterward. He didn't confess, but detectives noted he was visibly shaken during questioning. He claimed he had no knowledge of what happened, but Hunt wasn't done. She began digging deeper into Stanley's past and discovered something disturbing. He had previously been convicted for sexually abusing another underage family member. But it didn't end there. As word spread that Stanley had been arrested, several other female relatives came forward, sharing that he had assaulted them too. The stories followed the same pattern. Stanley would ask to stay with family members, claim he had nowhere else to go, and once inside the home, he'd target the youngest girls when no one else was around. For decades, he had used silence and threats as weapons. The abuse had been happening for 30 years. Still, Hunt worried it wouldn't be enough. The murder case lacked hard forensic evidence. No DNA, no fingerprints. So she went back to the files, searching for anything that might have been missed. That's when she made one final infuriating discovery. In the back of the file box, buried under years of paperwork, was a letter dated June 26, 2002, just 3 years after Jessica's murder. It had been sent by another jailhouse informant, who claimed his cellmate, Stanley Dishon, had confessed to killing his niece. The letter described the exact same story Detective Hunt had just heard in 2014, nearly 12 years later, from a completely different inmate. The similarities were undeniable. Stanley abducted Jessica, held her for days, abused her, then killed and disposed of her body near the roadside. The letter even mentioned the bedsheet, which the police had finally recovered from the barn. It was all there. And yet, back in 2002, detectives had done nothing with the information, no follow-up, no investigation, no search warrant. They had already locked on to David Brooks and ignored everything else. Detective Hunt was furious. If that lead had been taken seriously, Stanley Dishon might have been arrested 13 years earlier, and perhaps other young girls in the family would have been spared his abuse. Now, after all those years, the only path left was a trial. Jessica's parents had waited long enough. They wanted justice and closure. In 2015, proceedings began. Stanley Dishon stood before the court and declared his innocence. Jessica's parents sat just a few feet away, forced to look at the man who had not only shattered their family, but kept the truth buried for over a decade. The pain in the room was palpable. Despite the compelling testimony and circumstantial evidence, the prosecution feared that a murder conviction might be difficult. There were no eyewitnesses. The physical evidence, while powerful, was minimal. And there was another problem. For Stanley to be convicted of the sexual assaults on other girls in the family, each of the victims would be required to testify in open court. The trauma of reliving those horrors in front of strangers and the accused was simply too much to ask. So, the prosecution made a decision. They offered Stanley Dishon a plea deal. If he confessed to Jessica's murder and the assaults, they would take the death penalty off the table. He would receive a 20-year sentence with eligibility for parole after 15 years. In the end, Stanley accepted the deal, but under its terms, he was not required to disclose specific details about how he murdered Jessica. He admitted guilt, but refused to offer closure. Jessica's parents were devastated. After everything they had been through, all the delays, all the pain, they still didn't know exactly what happened to their daughter in those final days. But Stanley Dishon was finally behind bars. He was 56 at the time of sentencing. If released at the earliest possible date, he could walk free at 71. Jessica's father was clear. If his brother lived to see that day, he would be waiting. If he ever steps foot outside those prison gates, I'll be there. 4 years later, in 2019, Stanley gave his first public interview from prison. Incredibly, he claimed he was innocent, that he didn't kill Jessica. He said he was at work that morning, but after 2 decades, there was no way to verify that alibi. He also offered no explanation for how 2 unrelated inmates, years apart, told detectives the same story with details only the killer could have known. The circumstantial evidence was simply too overwhelming. As for David Brooks, investigators haven't entirely ruled out that he might have played a minor role, perhaps unknowingly. Stanley knew Brooks and may have asked him to help dispose of Jessica's belongings. With an IQ of 61, Brooks may not have fully grasped what was happening. It's possible he burned Jessica's clothes in a fire, or that he left her photograph in Stanley's shed, not realizing its significance. Or maybe Stanley planted it there to mislead investigators, but the full truth may never be known. Brooks died in 2021 from heart problems, taking his secrets with him. One final moment still haunts the Dishon family to this day. On the 3rd day after Jessica disappeared, her younger brother heard a cry for help outside their home. He swore it sounded like Jessica. He ran to his father, and they searched the area, but found nothing. Was it real? Could Jessica have been alive then, being held in Stanley's shed just miles away? Theories vary. Some believe it may have been a product of trauma and stress. Others think it was another person entirely. But there's a chilling, far-fetched theory that lingers. That Stanley had just arrived at the house and Jessica was in his car, taped and gagged or unconscious. We may never know. In the end, the tragedy of Jessica Dishon's murder is not just about one man's unspeakable crime. It's also about a system that failed her at every turn. From the botched initial investigation to ignored confessions and lost opportunities, justice was delayed far too long. Had authorities acted sooner, Jessica's killer could have been stopped, and more lives could have been protected. Today, her bedroom remains as it was the day she disappeared. Her family has never moved on, only forward, with a scar that will never fully heal. They fight now, not just for Jessica, but for all victims whose voices were silenced by indifference, ignorance, and injustice. What do you think about this tragic case? Do you believe the system did enough in the end? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story powerful, please like this video and subscribe for more true crime investigations. Justice delayed is justice denied. But sometimes, even a faint voice from the past can still be heard. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dark Case Files for more such cold cases.